The sight of the Athenian fleet filled the Sicilian Greeks with astonishment and alarm. For never before had so vast a force crossed the sea to their island. Thucydides. Hello, I'm Mark Selleck and welcome back to Casting Through Ancient Greece, episode 99, The Arrival in Sicily. When the Athenian armament at last pulled out from the Piraeus, the sight was unmatched in Athens history. Over 100 triremes and countless other ships swept westward across the Aegean, their oars raising and falling in perfect rhythm, their prows gleaming in the summer light. Behind them lay a city filled with pride and hope, yet also with apprehension. The prayers, the paeans, and the libations that had marked the fleet's departure had barely faded when doubts began to resurface. Those left behind in Athens wondered what fate would meet their sons on that distant and unfamiliar shore. Now, far from home, the Athenian commanders found themselves confronting the reality behind the grandeur. At sea, there were no cheering crowds, no orators' applause, only the relentless logistics of keeping the greatest armament in Greek history fed, coordinated, and disciplined. The immediate challenge was not yet war, but movement. The fleet needed to reach Sicily intact, maintaining order among its thousands of men, and begin to translate political ambition into practical strategy. Their course took them first to Corcyra, where the last contingents of the Allied forces assembled. From there they would follow the line of the Italian coast, before turning towards the Sicilian straits. But this route was more than a matter of navigation. Each stop along the way represented an opportunity and a test. The commanders hoped to draw support from the Greek cities of southern Italy, whose loyalties and fears would shape the expedition's early fortunes. It was at this stage that the differing temperaments of the generals became most apparent. Alcibiades viewed diplomacy as a campaign's first battlefield. He believed the sight of Athens' strength, this vast fleet and its disciplined ranks, would awe the Western Greeks into an alliance. With silvered words and confident promises, he sought to bind these distant cities into Athens' vision of empire. Nicias, by contrast, saw risk in every negotiation. He knew the resources of Athens were finite, and that each day spent in diplomacy delayed the campaign and strained the expedition's stores. Lamachus, the soldiers' general, urged decisive action, to strike Syracuse swiftly and crush the resistance before hesitation could sap the momentum. But as the fleet advanced, it became clear that even the first step of Alcibiades' grand design would prove difficult. The cities of Magna Graecia received Athens with cautious neutrality. They admired the splendour of the fleet, but feared to become entangled in a conflict that might draw Carthage or other Sicilian powers against them. The Athenians were given harbour, sometimes food and water, but no promises. What Athens had hoped would be a welcoming corridor to Sicily revealed itself as a chain of uncertain allies and wary observers. At Rhegium, where the fleet anchored in expectation of friendly reception, the limits of Athenian influence became clear. The Rhegians refused the Athenians entry into their city, allowing only the use of their outer harbour. This was no mere diplomatic slight, it was a warning. The Western Greeks would not easily be drawn into Athens' wars. Still, from this base, the Athenian commanders began to chart their first moves into Sicilian waters. Envoys were dispatched to Segesta, the city whose plea for help had sparked the expedition. The news that returned was devastating. The grand promise of Segesta's wealth, which had so swayed the Athenian assembly, were revealed to be false. The silver displayed to the original Athenian delegation had been borrowed, a deception meant to secure Athens' aid. The expedition, vast and costly as it was, had been launched on a mirage. Yet even as these early disappointments unfolded, darker news was travelling westward. The deepening investigations into the sacrilege back in Athens, the charges that had hung over Alcibiades at the time of departure, were no longer being quietly discussed, but openly pursued. His political enemies had waited until he was far from home to press their accusations, and now, as a fleet prepared for its first actions in Sicily, word came that he was to be recalled to stand trial. For Alcibiades, this was both a personal and strategic disaster. The man who had inspired the expedition with his vision and confidence was being removed at this critical moment, leaving command divided between Nicias' caution and Lamachus's boldness. In the episodes to come, we will see how this fracture would shape the course of the campaign. But for now, as the Athenians cast their eyes towards the Sicilian coast, the mood began to shift. What had begun as a grand and glorious venture was already showing the first signs of strain. Not in battle, but in divided purpose, uncertain allies, and the slow erosion of fortune that would come to define the Sicilian expedition. We have focused on events around Athens and their preparations for the expedition west for a couple of episodes now, though they were not acting in a vacuum. As we continue, we will see the Spartans also become involved with the campaign that would develop within Sicily. However, as rumours and news of Athens' preparations and launch of the expedition filtered west back to Sicily, those most directly affected would respond and make preparations themselves. Syracuse was the most powerful city on the island and would find themselves in conflict with any outside power attempting to force their influence within. Thucydides tells us that in Syracuse, the early rumours of Athens planning a campaign to their lands was disbelieved for some time, even though they were receiving news from multiple sources. Debates would end up taking place in the Syracusan assembly, where many differing viewpoints on Athens' intentions were discussed. Some would still believe that this grand fleet that had been rumoured to set sail against them didn't exist, with others still sceptical of the campaign, thinking if Athens were sailing, it was surely for more limited purposes, and posed no threat to Syracuse. These assumptions were based on that they thought Athens would not be foolish enough to launch such a major attack so far from home when still in conflict with Sparta. Though there was also another point of view developing that argued for a more proactive and preemptive approach, recognising the potential threat that Syracuse faced if Athens did land a major force within Sicily. In the debates in Syracuse, two main figures would emerge, with the opposing points of view behind them on the action Syracuse should take. The men were Hermocrates and Athenagoras, and Thucydides presents speeches they made to highlight the two opposing views existing in Syracuse at the time. Hermocrates had been present during the Congress of Gala back in 424 BC, and had made a speech appealing to the Sicilian cities to stop fighting each other and unite so as to protect the island from Athenian interference. Now in 415, he continued to push this same idea, calling on the Greeks of Sicily to create an anti-Athenian coalition. He had even argued to send ambassadors to the enemies of the Athenians to gain more powerful allies. Hermocrates was of the belief that the Athenian fleet was not a mere rumour and needed to be dealt with at once. Because of the threat he saw the Athenians posed to Sicily, he argued that Syracuse and their allies should sail out and meet the enemy in the Ionian Sea before it could land on Sicilian soil. So basically, he was advocating for Syracuse to take the Athenian threat seriously and wanted to take measures to deal with it at once. This being through arranging a strong defensive coalition while also acting aggressively militarily. Athenagoras, on the other hand, saw that the conflict between Athens and Sparta would prevent any large-scale attack on Sicily. As he argued, Athens would not risk a two-front war. He came down on the side that saw the news arriving in Syracuse about Athens' invasion as being exaggerated. Athens would not risk overextending themselves. Athenagoras also pointed to the strength of Syracuse, citing this as another reason Athens would not risk overextending themselves. To then further help his argument, he turned to accusing Hermocrates of inciting panic so as to gain himself more power and seize control of the city, exploiting the fear of an invasion. So we see Athenagoras on the other end of the political spectrum, sceptical of the news filtering into the city, and also promoting a path of caution. This being presented through a distrust of his political opponent, who he believed was seeking to gain political control of the city for his own rule. After both men had put forward their arguments, Thucydides has an unnamed Syracusan come forward, and from the sounds of it, was somewhat high-ranking, as he prevents anyone else coming forward during the assembly. He then appears to outline the course that Syracuse was to take, with it seeming to be compromised between the two arguments. Thucydides would have him say, "It is not a wise thing, either for speakers to make these attacks on each other, or for the hearers to give countenance to them. Instead, we should be giving our attention to the reports which have reached us, and seeing how we can all of us the state as a whole and each individual in it best deal with the invaders. Even if there is no need, there is no harm in having the state furnished with horses and arms and anything else that is glorious in war. We shall undertake the responsibility for this and see to the details. Nor is there any harm in sending to the cities to find out what their feelings and in doing anything else that may be thought useful. Here we see that this figure takes aboard the points made by Hermocrates on seeking alliances and preparing for an Athenian invasion, though he stops short of seeking immediate military action, with it seeming he is content on reacting to what may develop. With this presented to the assembly, it seems it was the word of authority, as when the speech was finished, the assembly would be dissolved. The Syracusans would end up sending out officers to reconnoitre the positions of the Athenian fleet. Once reliable reports returned that they were at Rhegium, the Syracusans would begin to act. Envoys and garrisons were sent throughout to secure support in the face of the Athenians and to secure military strategic points in the countryside. Meanwhile, the military resources available to Syracuse was reviewed and prepared for war that may come at any moment. Last episode, we looked at the direction each of the Athenian generals wanted to pursue, this being in light of the realities of their current position. We saw when they arrived at Rhegium, it had been assumed that they, along with other Italian cities, would join the Athenians. After all, Rhegium had been allied with Athens during their previous campaign. However, they found that everyone they encountered were for the most part looking to distance themselves from the Athenians. Rhegium would allow the Athenian fleet into the harbour, camp outside their walls and purchase supplies, but the town was closed off to them. Thucydides doesn't elaborate on why Rhegium now took this view on neutrality, rather than open friendship they had only a few years earlier. However, Donald Kagan presents one idea that may have seen this shift in attitude. He would say, the likeliest explanation is their perception of the vast size of the second expedition, which made it seem the Athenians had come to conquer in the west, as they had in the east, but not as they claimed to help their allies in local quarrels and to check the ambitions of the Syracusans. Kagan then continues by suggesting that if the force of 60 ships that had originally been voted would probably not have made this same impression. Further to this setback was the news that had returned from the vessels that had been sent to Segesta. They had come back with only 30 talents, and it was now seen Segesta was in no position to fund the fleet as they had promised. This had seen each of the three generals reassess the situation, and they would propose their re-evaluated course of action. Nicias wanted to settle the war with Silenus, display their power, and then return home, since there would be little Segestan support. Alcibiades wanted to offer an alliance to all the Sicilian cities that they could, and once it was known who was with them, then attack an isolated Syracuse and Silenus. While Lamachus proposed an immediate attack on Syracuse, using surprise and their formidable reputation to their advantage before their true position was discovered. These being all the viewpoints put forward, would not see any action since all the generals had differing proposals. Lamachus recognised this and would end up agreeing with Alcibiades, since his view still advocated attacking Syracuse. With two of the generals now in agreement, they could now begin to take measures to continue the campaign. The Athenian fleet was still at Rhegium, but still without a main base of operations. With Alcibiades and Lamachus on the same page, the generals now looked to establish the Athenian position and continuing the campaign. Since Rhegium would not support the Athenians, Alcibiades sailed off in an attempt to gain an alliance with Messenia just across the strait. However, here he was met with a similar attitude as what was encountered at Rhegium. Messenia would not receive the Athenians inside the city, but would only make markets outside the city available to them. With this rejection, Alcibiades sailed back to the fleet at Rhegium, and preparations were made for half the fleet to sail out to attempt to influence Sicilian cities on the coast, using the sight of the Athenian fleet to help persuade them. Two of the generals, with it seeming Alcibiades was one, accompanied the fleet, while the third general remained behind at Rhegium, with the rest of the forces. The first target of the fleet was Naxos, just down the coast from Messenia. Here the Athenians were given entry to the city. Perhaps the sight of the fleet off their coast had some bearing, but Naxos was also an enemy of Syracuse. The Athenians also tried their luck a bit further down the coast, to Catana, but the city was under control by a pro-Syracusan faction, so prevented the Athenians from gaining access. The fleet then continued south, where they made camp after entering into the river Tiraeus, not far from Leontini. The next day the fleet continued on to Syracuse, where 10 ships then detached from the fleet and entered the harbour to see if the Syracusans had yet launched their fleet, and to make a proclamation outlining their intention to restoring the Leontinians to their lands. This was also basically a declaration of war on Syracuse. With this done, and no Syracusan opposition in the harbour, the 10 ships reconnoitred the city, its harbours, and surrounding coastline before returning to the rest of the fleet. The fleet then headed back north, where they once again stopped in at Catana, where the army was again denied entry, but this time they allowed the generals inside to address the assembly. However, it appears that Alcibiades had a plan in place to influence the mood inside the city this time around. While Alcibiades was addressing the assembly in Catana, the Athenian troops that had been with the ships managed to force their way through the city through the poorly constructed gates outside. It wasn't long before there were now Athenian forces strolling around the marketplace. Once the pro-Syracusan faction in the city became aware of the Athenians now inside their walls, word went around their ranks and they slipped out of the assembly and the city. With the pro-Syracusan elements now out of the city and Athenian forces walking freely within, the rest of the population voted in favour of an alliance with Athens, and for them to bring the rest of their fleet over. So in this way, Alcibiades was able to finally secure a base from which the Athenians could continue their campaign into Sicily. With this first success on Sicily proper, the Athenian generals became enthusiastic of reports coming in that the city of Caramina on the southern coast was willing to come over to the Athenians if they would sail to their city. This prospect of additional allies on Sicily would see Athens man their fleet and begin sailing around the coast. They had also been advised that the Syracusans were also currently manning a fleet. This was the reason the Athenians sailed out with the entire fleet, as they anticipated that they might fight a decisive naval engagement against the Syracusans. However, when sailing on Syracuse, no fleet was present, so the Athenians continued to Caramina. However, on their arrival, it would appear the information they had initially received was not reliable, as the city would not receive them. The generals, meeting no success here, sailed the fleet back towards Catana, but on their return journey, they stopped off and raided Syracusan territory. In this action, a small skirmish would result with some Athenian light troops and Syracusan cavalry, where Athens would suffer its first casualties in the campaign. When the fleet did finally return to Catana, they found the ship sent out by Athens, the Salamina, was waiting. As we saw last episode, this was the ship that had been sent out with orders to return with Alcibiades, so he could answer the charges awaiting him in Athens. Orders on the ship were to recall Alcibiades and others to return to Athens to answer the charges over sacrilegious activities in the city. The view was that if he wished, Alcibiades would have been able to possibly start a mutiny over the party sent in the Salamina. However, given the slow start and setbacks on the campaign so far, Alcibiades seems to have gauged that the enthusiastic support he had originally had with the army had somewhat cooled. So instead of potentially making matters worse for himself and creating a distraction from the main goal of the campaign, he accepted the direction given by the Salamina and promised to follow in his own trireme. We also heard that the crew of the Salamina were given orders to not arrest him, as they were also mindful of not wanting to agitate the army in Sicily. So here, I just want to pause for a minute and just highlight a point to do with the trials that were taking place. We have seen that the matters over the Herms and mocking other religious matters were being taken very seriously. They'd even been connected to an attack on Athenian democracy, as they attacked some of the foundational religious ideas of the city. For sure, some looked to take advantage of the matters and fan the flames of conspiracy, but we can also see through Thucydides that the threat was taken seriously by many. Perhaps for us, it could be seen the Athenians were overreacting to these charges, but we can see at this point why they appear to act so forcefully. As we have seen in our early episodes, Athens had been at the mercy of tyrants before. Thucydides reminds us of the period under which Pisistratus and then his sons Hippias and Hipparchus ruled Athens. As we had seen, the time under the two brothers was a particularly oppressive rule. What truly worried the Athenians about this period was that the end of tyranny, although celebrated as being brought down by Aristogeiton, they knew the reality that it was the Spartans that truly saw the tyranny brought to an end. However, this intervention also threatened the democracy surviving. So we see here that Thucydides is pointing out that Athens was particularly paranoid around anything threatening the foundational values of the city because of this episode in Athens' past. So, back to Alcibiades' recall. We hear that the citizens back in Athens had become more convinced that he had a major role in the sacrilegious acts. While Alcibiades' enemies back in Athens were working on convincing everyone of his involvement, another event would take place that would feed heavily into the people's paranoia. The Spartans, acting with the Boeotians, had marched into the isthmus. This action now had the Athenians convinced that Alcibiades was acting against the city and had arranged the moves with the Spartans. This news had also convinced the assembly that they had taken the correct path with the arrests and executions that had already taken place. They believed that if they had not done these, the city would have been betrayed to the Spartans. This had now seen that the feelings towards him within the city were extremely hostile, very different to when he had sailed out with the fleet. So Alcibiades and the others who were also accused alongside him boarded his trireme and began following the Salamina back to Athens. However, along the way, Alcibiades must have learnt of the true nature of the people in Athens and the complete reversal in feeling towards him. He must have concluded that given the level of prejudice against him, he was essentially sailing back to a show trial. The journey back to Athens had set out north, departing Catana and headed up to the southern Italy. Once the ships had reached Thurii, in Italy, Alcibiades and some of his co-accused saw their opportunity to flee the ships and head inland. The Salamina remained at Thurii for some time, searching for the fugitives, but came up empty-handed. The Salamina returned to Athens with the news of Alcibiades' escape, and at once the assembly passed the sentence of death on him and his companions. Further to this, all his property was seized, his name was inscribed on a stele of disgrace on the Acropolis, and a decree was made that anyone who had captured or killed Alcibiades or his followers would be rewarded a talent. Also fitting, given the nature of his crime, he was found to be guilty of. The Eleusinian priests also cursed him. Once the coast was clear, literally, Alcibiades and those with him managed to acquire a boat, from where they would then make the journey from Thurii all the way to the Peloponnese. Plutarch would give an anecdote that with all the punishments passed by the Athenians in his absence, he would supposedly respond, "I will show them that I am still alive." With the departure of Alcibiades, the army in Sicily was now left with two generals commanding it. With Alcibiades out of the way, we could see that Nicias may have had the opportunity to change the strategic direction of the campaign. However, we need to remember Lamachus was still one of the generals, and had thrown his support behind Alcibiades' strategy. In addition to this, it appears that Nicias recognised that as much as he would like to have followed his passive strategy now and return home as soon as possible, this strategy was no longer as feasible, given the passage of time and the sums of money already invested in the expedition. If he were to return back to Athens with the fleet and nothing to show but a great loss of money, prestige and resources, he would surely have ended his own political career, at the very least. However, Nicias' actions for the rest of the year's campaigning season were hardly decisive. He did not look to make any aggressive moves against Syracuse, but rather attempt to sort the issue out with Segesta that had initially seen Athens become involved. He directed the whole fleet towards Segesta, with Plutarch telling us that his fleet sailed as far from the Syracusan force as possible. The fleet made its way along the northwest of the island. However, when coming up upon Himera, they were not permitted to land there, even though this was the only Greek city in what was the Carthaginian-dominated region. Though the fleet would continue westwards until they came upon Hycara, a Sicilian city that was hostile towards Segesta. The Athenians landed and attacked, and took the city, enslaving the non-Greeks, and then turned the city over to Segesta. With Hycara captured, Nicias would then continue on with a party to Segesta, with the intention of collecting funds for his forces that had been originally promised to Athens before the launching of the campaign. Here Nicias was able to find out firsthand that Segesta did not have the means to fund the expedition, as they had initially assured the Athenians. He would return to the forces with just 30 more talents, and the fleet would make its way back to Catana, where it would establish itself for the winter. This would see the final meaningful manoeuvres of the first campaigning season in Sicily. As we have seen, calling it a disappointment would be an understatement, given the excitement and resources Athens had given to the expedition in its build-up and departure. Nothing of any significance was achieved in fulfilling the objectives. In fact, the Athenians had failed to secure even what was considered as mere formalities that would go on to launching their campaign proper on the island. The allies they expected to flock to them did not eventuate, and were hard-pressed to even gain a friendly foothold to continue the campaign. While the funds they expected to receive to keep their men paid, and the expedition well-resourced, failed to materialise. To further exacerbate the situation was the disagreements with the plan forward from the three generals. Although Alcibiades would gain support from Lamachus, he was soon after recalled to Athens, where he then slipped away before leaving Italy. This then left Nicias, who appears to now have been the influential commander, to steer the expedition. Though he did not believe in the goals of the campaign, and with Alcibiades' departure, he had no clear strategy forward. Plutarch would sum up the end of the first season in Sicily as follows. After a little while, the Athenians summoned Alcibiades home to stand trial, and then Nicias, who nominally still had a colleague in command, but really wielded sole power, made no end of sitting idle, or cruising aimlessly about, or taking deliberate counsel, until the vigorous hopes of his men grew old and feeble, and the consternation and fears with which the first sight of his forces had filled his enemies slowly subsided. This basically highlighting that the Athenians had wasted an opportunity of inflicting a quick and decisive victory over Syracuse. Though, as we have pointed out, Nicias did not dare leave Sicily and return to Athens with so much committed and already spent, given that nothing of note had been achieved. During the winter, both the Athenians and Syracusans were preparing themselves for battle that they had anticipated to develop at some stage. Thucydides tells us that the Syracusans had initially been hesitant at meeting the Athenians, but with Athens' caution and failures, their confidence had grown to where the generals were urging for an attack to be ordered on the Athenians at Catana. The Syracusans, with their confidence up due to the Athenians failing to march out against them, then began harassing the Athenians with their cavalry patrols during the winter. During these patrols, they would attempt to get into the heads of the Athenians with insults and would also seek intelligence on the intentions of the Athenians. However, Nicias and Lamachus could not leave the army in this situation. Morale was already taking a hit, so they now began to plan their first attack on Syracuse. The Syracusans were now ready to meet the Athenian attack, so this had taken the possibility of launching a surprise amphibious assault on Syracuse away from them. The other dilemma Nicias had to contend with was while it was relatively safe to march the hoplite army into Syracuse, the light troops and camp followers would have been extremely vulnerable to cavalry attack, an arm the Syracusans were well equipped in, while the Athenians had almost none to speak of. However, if the Syracusan army could be drawn out and marched onto Catana, then the Athenians would not be vulnerable to a march onto the enemy city, and this also opened up the possibility of an amphibious attack once again. So we then hear of Nicias coming up with a plan to deceive the Syracusans. To convince the Syracusans to march out, the Athenians sent a local man from Catana that they had trusted with a message to Syracuse. That man was to provide them information and convince the Syracusans he was working on their side. He would do this by informing the Syracusans of a supposed vulnerability of the Athenians in their camp. He would tell them that the Athenians were in the habit of camping inside the walls of Catana, away from their camp where they held their main arms. He said that if the Syracusans would fix a day to march onto Catana, the pro-Syracusans within the city would at daybreak, when the Syracusans appeared outside, would lock the gates and burn the Athenian ships, seeing the Athenians would not be able to equip themselves and be isolated. To further convince the Syracusans he was working with them, he named men he knew to be pro-Syracusan, that the government in Syracuse would think has been active in the scheme. The Syracusan generals, already buoyed by the rising confidence, found the message appealing. The prospect of catching the Athenians unarmed and unformed was precisely the sort of stroke that could end the war before it truly began. Thucydides notes that the Syracusans did not dismiss the information as dubious or overly convenient. They were prepared, even eager, to believe anything that confirmed their own growing sense of superiority. The winter skirmishing had taught them that the Athenians were not the unstoppable force once imagined, and Nicias's refusal, thus far to take the initiative, appeared to reinforce the notion that the invaders were stretched thin and vulnerable. In Syracuse the plan was debated, though not with the same caution that had marked the earlier assemblies. The presence of named sympathisers within Catana gave the scheme a veneer of authenticity, and the promise of delivering a decisive blow without the risks of a set-piece battle was also too enticing for the leadership to ignore. A day was fixed, and orders were issued for the Syracusan army to march north at dawn, confident that the Athenians, so the messenger had insisted, would be scrambling for their arms as the city gates closed behind them. Yet this was precisely the outcome Nicias had intended. By drawing the Syracusan army onto the plains between Syracuse and Catana, he removed the central obstacle to an Athenian offensive, the enemy cavalry. Away from the immediate support of their city, and drawn in the open, the Syracusans would leave their horsemen without the same advantage of terrain and reinforcement. More importantly, their absence from Syracuse left the city exposed to a sudden landing. What Nicias required was not merely to lure the Syracusans out, but to ensure that the Athenians could bypass them entirely. When the appointed day arrived and the Syracusan army marched out in strength, Nicias gave the signal. The Athenians embarked swiftly from Catana, boarding their ships and sailing south under cover of the very dust and movement created by the Syracusan advance. Thucydides tells us that the Syracusans only realised they had been deceived when they reached Catana and found no enemy army, only empty fields and the locals, who would offer no assistance. By that time, the Athenians had already made for the great harbour, landing at the beach near Olympion, the sacred precinct of Zeus, chosen precisely because it provided both space to form up and a secure position from which to challenge the Syracusan army on equal terms. It was here, on Syracusan soil for the first time, that the Athenians prepared to strike the opening blows of the campaign. The arrival was not the triumphant show of force envisioned in Athens months earlier, but it was nevertheless a bold and carefully executed manoeuvre, one that showed Nicias, despite his caution, was capable of strategic deception worthy of any of his predecessors. The Athenians fortified their position, secured their landing site, and readied themselves for the Syracusan rapid return from Catana. The stage was now set for this first clash on the fields before Syracuse, where both sides would test the assumptions and expectations built over the long winter. When the Syracusan army finally realised the ruse, they abandoned their march north and hastened back towards Syracuse by the most direct route. Their return, however, was anything but orderly. Units were stretched out along the road, cavalry outriding the infantry in an attempt to regain the field first, and the generals found it difficult to gather their full force before the Athenians could complete their deployment. Nicias had anticipated as much. His men were arrayed in good order near the Olympion, with the hoplites forming the core of the line and the light troops placed to harass the Syracusans as they arrived piecemeal. The Syracusans, nevertheless, advanced with boldness, encouraged by the belief that the Athenians were still unsettled from their sudden landing. Thucydides describes the fighting that followed as sharp and closely contested. The Syracusan hoplites were numerous and fought with spirit, but they lacked the cohesion and training that the Athenians, veterans of years of campaigning, brought to the field. Athenian archers and pelters, though outmatched by Syracusan cavalry, made good use of the open ground before the temple precinct, disrupting the Syracusan attempts to form a solid line. At a crucial moment, the Syracusan cavalry, usually their greatest advantage, found themselves constrained. Their rapid return from Catana had left them without time to coordinate a decisive charge, and the terrain immediately around the Olympion limited their ability to turn the Athenian flank. As the infantry lines clashed, the Athenians gradually pressed the Syracusans back. The Syracusan centre eventually gave way, withdrawing towards the city while the cavalry provided a covering screen to protect the route. Thucydides also makes mention of a storm breaking out during the battle that may have also had some effect on the morale of the relatively inexperienced Syracusan army. The Athenians won the field, but were unable to pursue far, knowing well that any attempt to chase the retiring Syracusans towards their walls would expose them to renewed cavalry attack. Still, the victory was meaningful. It demonstrated that even without Alcibiades, and despite internal doubts, the Athenian force could outmaneuver and outfight the Syracusans when given the opportunity. The Athenians erected a trophy near the temple of Zeus, while the Syracusans gathered their dead under a truce, each side aware that this opening engagement was only a prelude to a far larger struggle. The events of the first strike on Syracuse encapsulate much of what has defined the Athenian campaign so far. Flashes of strategic ingenuity, movements of hesitation, and a persistent imbalance between Athenian expectations and the realities on the ground. The Athenians had proven they could deceive and outfight the Syracusans, yet they had not delivered the decisive blow the city citizens back at home likely imagined when the expedition was launched. Their army was now established on Syracusan soil, but the obstacles that had plagued them since their arrival in Sicily, limited cavalry, a divided command, and the loss of Alcibiades, had not disappeared with this initial victory. Meanwhile, Syracuse itself was awakening to the full seriousness of the threat. No longer could its leaders assume the Athenians were paralysed by indecision or weakness, or weakened by internal discord. The landing near the Olympion and the subsequent defeat of their field army forced the Syracusans to reassess their defences, reorganise their command, and prepare their people for a siege that was now not only possible, but increasingly likely. For the Athenians, the victory offered a much-needed boost in morale, yet it also set the stage for the logistical and strategic challenges that would soon define the next phase of the campaign. Establishing a permanent base of operations, deciding how to tighten the noose around Syracuse, and navigating the political pressures simmering within the Athenian camp. All of these questions now demanded answers. In our next episode, we will pick up from this moment of transition. We will look at how both sides responded in the weeks that followed, the Syracusans' attempts to overhaul their command structure and improve their defences, and the Athenians' efforts to establish a foothold from which to prosecute a sustained campaign. We'll explore how the initial engagement shaped the strategies each side adopted and set in motion the long and arduous struggle that would come to define this Sicilian expedition. The first clash had been fought and won, but the true test for Athens was now only beginning.